Welcome to the History Maps podcast. In 1945, the most severe threat to the American monopoly on atomic weapons wasn't, a Soviet military commander sitting in some fortified war room in Moscow.
Right. It wasn't a general or a politician at all.
No, not at all. It was actually an 18-year-old physics prodigy. He was just walking the dusty streets of Los Alamos, New Mexico, and deciding entirely on his own to give away the blueprints for the ultimate weapon.
Yeah, he simply looked around and concluded that a unipolar nuclear world was, well, a dangerous imbalance.
Exactly.
And because of his highly specific position within the Manhattan Project, he possessed the actual technical data to alter that balance himself.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the covert intelligence operations, the agent recruitment networks, and the cryptography that really defined global espionage from 1947 to 1991.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. And we are drawing from a very specific stack of sources for this. We're looking at declassified project files like Venona, some really detailed historical breakdowns of the Cambridge Five and the atomic spies, and extensive analyses of signals intelligence and the mass surveillance state of the East German Stasi.
And as we examine the people who pass these secrets, it is essential to look at their mindsets objectively as historical facts.
Right, we have to stay neutral here.
Exactly. Some individuals were driven by a fervent belief in Marxist-Leninist communism, viewing it as a necessary bulwark against fascism, while others on the opposite side were deeply dedicated to democratic capitalism and Western deterrence.
So just a quick note to you listening. We are exploring the mechanics of those deeply held beliefs and how they drove historical events. We are definitely not evaluating or endorsing the politics themselves.
Absolutely not. We are just looking at the facts and the sources.
Okay, let's unpack this. We really have to begin with the most immediate existential reality of the early Cold War, which is the atomic bomb.
The ultimate geopolitical prize.
Exactly, the knowledge of how to split the atom and harness that energy. But what you might be wondering is how someone actually rationalizes handing over that kind of destructive power to a foreign intelligence service.
Yeah, it wasn't always like a clandestine meeting in a dark alley with a briefcase full of cash.
No, in the early days, particularly during and immediately after the Second World War, the primary motivation for many of these scientific spies was actually a profound ideological commitment.
That is a crucial point. Many of the individuals involved in the atomic spy rings had lived through the violent rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s.
Right.
For them, the Soviet Union, which was taking the brunt of the casualties fighting the Axis powers on the Eastern Front, well, it appeared to be the only viable force capable of stopping fascism.
So they essentially viewed assisting the Soviet nuclear program as an anti-fascist moral imperative.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Let us look closely at Klaus Fuchs. He was a German-born theoretical physicist. He actually fled Germany in 1933, earned his PhD in Bristol in 1937, and eventually became one of the lead scientists working on the British nuclear program.
Before transferring over to the American Manhattan Project, right?
Right, so he had access to the absolute highest levels of scientific data. And, he didn't just give the Soviets vague concepts. He gave them the exact engineering mechanics.
He provided a highly detailed technical roadmap. To really understand the gravity of what Fuchs delivered, we have to look at the specific hurdles of building an atomic weapon.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So first, he provided crucial information on the electromagnetic separation of uranium. You see, uranium-235, which is the fissile isotope needed for a bomb, makes up less than 1% of natural uranium.
Right, it's mostly uranium-238.
Exactly. And separating them is an incredibly arduous process because they are chemically identical. You have to separate them using mass and magnetic fields, a process that required massive industrial facilities like those at Oak Ridge.
And Fuchs just handed over the data on how to optimize this separation.
He did. He gave them the exact math for it.
And beyond the uranium, he gave them the details for the plutonium implosion bomb. This is where we get back to that 18-year-old kid we mentioned at the start, Theodore Hall.
Ah, yes, Ted Hall.
Hall was the youngest physicist at Los Alamos. His motivation, as the historical records show, stemmed from his socialist views and a specific fear that an American monopoly on atomic weapons would just lead to unchecked aggression.
So he unilaterally decided to pass on the design of the Fat Man plutonium bomb, along with several chemical processes for purifying plutonium.
But the key here is why the implosion design was so highly classified in the first place.
Right. Well, it comes down to what physicists call the fizzle problem.
The fizzle problem, okay.
Yeah. The Manhattan Project scientists realized that the plutonium they were breeding in nuclear reactors contained an isotope called plutonium-240. And this isotope has a very high rate of spontaneous fission.
So it's highly unstable.
Very. If you try to assemble a critical mass of this plutonium by just shooting two pieces together like a bullet in a gun barrel.
Which was the design for the uranium bomb, right?
Exactly. But if you try that with plutonium, the plutonium-240 will start a chain reaction too early. It will release enough energy to just blow the bomb apart before it achieves optimal compression.
Meaning it fizzles.
That is a fizzle.
So to solve that fizzle problem, they had to compress a solid sphere of plutonium symmetrically from all sides and do it instantly using conventional explosives.
Right.
This required incredibly precise explosive lenses, basically arrangements of fast-burning and slow-burning explosives that shape the shockwaves into a perfect converging sphere.
It is an intensely complex physics and engineering problem. And Hall, along with Fick's, essentially handed the Soviets the solution on a silver platter.
They absolutely did. And we also have to consider the contribution of George Koval in all this.
Oh, Koval is a fascinating case.
Yeah. Koval was an American-born son of a Belarusian immigrant family who had returned to the Soviet Union. He was drafted into the Red Army and recruited by Soviet military intelligence, the GRU.
Operating under the codename Delmar, I believe.
Right, Delmar. And he infiltrated the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the Dayton Project. He literally worked inside the United States Army as a radiation health officer.
And what Koval provided was really the final piece of the puzzle, which was the detonator.
Because to make that implosion bomb work, you need a massive, instantaneous flood of neutrons at the exact microsecond of maximum compression.
Exactly. And Koval supplied the Soviets with critical information about the Urchin detonator used on the Fat Man bomb.
So how did the Urchin actually work?
The Urchin was a brilliant, intricate little device. It consisted of a small sphere of beryllium and polonium-210, and they were separated by these incredibly thin layers of gold and nickel foil.
So the foil keeps them apart until the exact right moment.
Yes. When the conventional explosives crushed the plutonium core, that shockwave also crushed the Urchin right in the center.
And that breaks the foil.
Exactly. The gold foil ruptured, allowing the polonium's alpha particles to strike the beryllium. This reaction released the precise burst of neutrons needed to ignite the nuclear chain reaction.
And his espionage was so well executed that it wasn't even known to the West until the year 2007.
Wait, really? 2007?
Yeah, that is when the Russian government posthumously recognized him as a hero of the Russian Federation.
That is quite a delayed revelation.
It is. But getting all this highly technical data back to Moscow required a really robust network. These scientists relied heavily on couriers and handlers, most notably the network associated with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
Right. Julius essentially recruited potential spies, including Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who worked as a machinist at Los Alamos.
And the transmission of this intelligence was dangerously analog,
Yeah.
Consider the process for David Greenglass. He was physically machining the molds for those highly classified explosive lenses we just discussed.
So to pass this information, Greenglass just quietly sketched out the high-explosive lens molds on a piece of paper. He folded it up and handed it off to a courier named Harry Gold in this brief, unremarkable exchange.
I mean, it is just a simple transaction of folded paper. But those lines on the page were literally the architectural blueprints for a weapon of mass destruction.
And the consequences for that network were severe. The Rosenbergs were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage.
And despite massive international appeals for clemency, they were executed in 1953.
Yeah, President Dwight D. Eisenhower justified denying clemency for Ethel Rosenberg by reasoning that sparing her would only encourage the Soviets to specifically recruit women as spies.
To exploit Western judicial leniency, basically.
Exactly. It was a chillingly pragmatic calculus by a head of state, really reflecting the existential stakes of the era. All of this stolen intelligence essentially allowed the Soviet Union to detonate their first atomic bomb by August 1949.
Which completely altered the global balance of power and accelerated the arms race by several years. But I want to push back on something here regarding the psychology of these scientists.
Okay, sure.
We often label them as purely ideological spies. But was it truly just high-minded anti-fascist ideology that drove guys like Hall and Fuchs?
You mean, was there something else motivating them?
Yeah, because if you are a physicist in a laboratory and you decide to unilaterally balance the geopolitical scales of the globe, I mean, that requires a staggering level of ego.
Right.
Isn't there an element of supreme arrogance at play here? The belief that unelected scientists have the right to just dictate nuclear parity.
What's fascinating here is the intersection of ideology and ego. To commit espionage at that level requires a person to firmly believe that their personal intellect and their moral compass are vastly superior to the laws, policies, and elected governments of the nation they reside in.
So they see themselves above the law.
Exactly. They convinced themselves that they were acting on behalf of humanity itself. And that is an inherently arrogant position. The ideology provides the framework and the justification, but the ego provides the permission to act.
It is playing God with the laws of physics and international security, basically.
It really is.
Now, while the atomic spies were penetrating the scientific laboratories, there was an entirely different vulnerability happening within the diplomatic and intelligence establishments.
Right, because the scientists had access to the formulas, but the politicians and intelligence officers, they had access to the strategy.
Exactly. Which brings us to the infamous Cambridge Five. We are shifting from the scientific minds of Los Alamos to the aristocratic establishment of Britain.
The Cambridge Five. This ring included Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross.
And these were not, struggling, disenfranchised citizens. They were recruited in the 1930s while attending the University of Cambridge by the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the KGB.
Right. And Anthony Blunt, who was older and a fellow of Trinity College, actually acted as a talent spotter for the Soviets.
Identifying students with anti-fascist leanings who were destined for high government office.
And their infiltration of the British government was remarkably deep and sustained. I mean, Kim Philby rose to a senior position in MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, eventually heading the counter-Soviet section.
Talk about the fox guarding the henhouse.
Seriously. And Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess held incredibly sensitive positions in the Foreign Office, with Maclean serving in Washington and gaining access to joint U.S. and U.K. atomic policy.
Then you have Anthony Blunt, who is in MI5, the Domestic Security Service, and Blunt's cover is almost too cinematic to be real.
It really is.
While actively spying for MI5 and passing secrets to Moscow, he also served as the surveyor of the King's pictures.
Right.
So he is literally walking the halls of Buckingham Palace, curating the royal art collection, all while working as a Soviet asset.
Meanwhile, John Cairncross worked at the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, intercepting German communications, and later he was at MI6.
And the sheer volume of material they compromised is just staggering. Cairncross alone supplied over 5,800 documents to the Soviets.
And in the early part of 1945 alone, Guy Burgess handed over 389 top-secret documents.
Wow, that is a massive leak.
They provided Moscow with an unparalleled window into Western strategic thinking, diplomatic negotiating positions, and internal intelligence operations.
But, when you read the sources, there is a profound irony in how the Soviets actually received this windfall of data.
Yes, the paranoia factor.
Exactly. The KGB controller in London, Yuri Modin, and the authorities back in Moscow, they initially mistrusted these double agents.
They did. They found it incredibly difficult to believe that these men could have secured such unfettered access to the absolute highest levels of British intelligence.
Because the Soviet system was built on pervasive suspicion.
Right. For an intelligence officer in Moscow, accustomed to a society where trust was a liability, the intelligence provided by the Cambridge Five seemed too high level.
Like it was too good to be true.
Exactly. Too voluminous and just too easy to obtain. They suspected it was an elaborate British deception operation.
And furthermore, someone like Kim Philby had a known communist past from his university days.
Which was on record.
Yeah. So the Soviets could not fathom how British security vetting could be so lax as to allow a former communist sympathizer to head the anti-Soviet desk of MI6.
They genuinely thought it was a trap. The sources indicate that about half of the documents the British spies sent to Moscow during the war were never even read initially because of this paranoia.
They just archived them, unread.
Unread. But eventually the unraveling of this ring began, and it was a slow, agonizing process for the British establishment.
Right. So in 1951, Philby learned that American and British authorities, using decrypted cables, were closing in on a mole inside the British embassy in Washington. This mole was codenamed Homer.
And Philby, due to his position, realized that Homer was actually Donald Maclean.
Because Philby's own survival depended on Maclean not breaking under interrogation, he used Guy Burgess to warn Maclean.
So in the summer of 1951, both McLean and Burgess fled to the Soviet Union, eventually surfacing in the city of Samara.
And that flight immediately cast a massive shadow of suspicion over Philby, right?
Right.
Because he had been living with Burgess in Washington.
Right. The ensuing investigation forced Philby's resignation from MI6.
Yet Philby managed to basically brazen it out for years. I mean, he subjected himself to intense interrogations and maintained his innocence, eventually working as a journalist in Beirut.
It wasn't until 1963, when his old friend and MI6 officer Nicholas Elliott confronted him with new evidence, that Philby finally confessed.
And then he subsequently defected aboard a Soviet freighter bound for Odessa.
The public reckoning for the others was delayed even longer, completely shrouded in establishment secrecy.
Right. Anthony Blunt secretly confessed in 1964 in exchange for immunity from prosecution, which is a fact that was kept entirely hidden from the British public.
Until Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was basically compelled to reveal it in the House of Commons in 1979.
And Karen Cross also confessed in secret in 1964, but his public exposure didn't happen until 1979, when an investigative journalist tracked him down.
Let us think about the demoralizing effect this had. I mean, the British establishment was shaken to its core.
Oh, absolutely. And it sowed a deep, lasting mistrust between U.S. and U.K. intelligence services. The Americans looked at London and thought their intelligence agencies were just entirely compromised.
But I have a question about the mechanics of this failure, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, actually, I think you brought this up earlier regarding how they got away with it.
Right, yeah. I wanted to ask you about guys like Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, who their own Soviet handlers described as incredibly reckless.
Oh, extremely reckless.
Right, I mean, Burgess was known to be a heavy drinker who allegedly dropped highly classified Foreign Office files on the pavement outside of a pub.
Yeah, not exactly stealthy.
So how on earth did they operate for decades? It is like a high-security bank vault, where the only background check is whether you know the manager's cousin and went to the right boarding school. How does an institution become that blind?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really exposes the fatal flaw of the British establishment at that time, which was an absolute uncritical reliance on social class as a proxy for loyalty.
So if you're one of us, you must be loyal.
Exactly. The underlying assumption within MI5 and MI6 was that men of a certain breeding, educated at institutions like Cambridge or Oxford, they simply did not commit treason against their own class.
So their eccentricities, their heavy drinking, even their outspoken political arguments.
They were tolerated as upper-class quirks, rather than identified as severe security risks. The institution was culturally incapable of seeing the threat precisely because the threat looked, spoke, and acted exactly like them.
So the vulnerability wasn't technical at all. It was cultural.
100% cultural.
And that leads perfectly into the next major evolution in this shadow war. Because when human intelligence proves to be so catastrophically compromised by ideological moles hidden in plain sight, well, an intelligence agency has to find a method of gathering information that does not rely on human loyalty.
You have to turn to mathematics and technology.
Exactly. With the human element proving far too susceptible to ideological conversion or blackmail or betrayal, the focus shifted to the realm of signals intelligence.
Right, because if you cannot trust the people writing the diplomatic cables, you have to find a way to read the adversary's cables.
So how did the West actually begin to discover the extent of Soviet espionage? It was not through a defector initially, it was through Project Venona.
Ah, Project Venona.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Project Venona was initiated in February 1943 by the U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Service.
And the mission was straightforward, but seemingly impossible from a mathematical standpoint, which was to break the unbreakable Soviet diplomatic code system.
So to understand why it was considered mathematically unbreakable, we have to examine the specific encryption mechanics the Soviets employed.
It was a two-step process, wasn't it?
Yes. First, the Soviet system utilized codebooks that assigned 4-digit numerical values to specific words, phrases, and names.
But sending those 4-digit numbers over the airwaves would be too easy to crack through basic frequency analysis.
Right, so they encrypted those numerical values a second time, using what is known as a one-time pad.
Okay, let us explain how a one-time pad works, because it is crucial to understanding the breakthrough here.
Go for it.
Imagine you want to secure a safe, and you use a combination lock. But instead of a fixed combination, you generate a completely random sequence of numbers, use it to lock the safe exactly once, and then you just burn the paper with the combination on it.
Okay, makes sense.
And the receiver has an identical, securely delivered copy of that exact same random sequence. They use it to open the safe, and then they destroy their copy.
So if that pad of numbers is truly random, it's as long as the encryption key itself and is never reused.
The cipher is mathematically absolute. No amount of computing power can crack it because there is simply no underlying pattern to find.
That makes it sound flawless.
Yeah.
But the flaw in any cryptographic system is rarely the mathematics, right? It is the human beings executing the system.
That is correct. Under the immense logistical pressure of the Second World War, with the Soviet Union fighting a massive land war against Germany, the facilities manufacturing these one-time pads in the Soviet Union fell behind.
The Soviet operators made a critical, catastrophic error.
They began reusing pages of the one-time pads.
Right. So going back to our safe analogy, it is as if the bank manager used the exact same random combination to lock two completely different safes on different days.
Exactly. Suddenly, there is a pattern. American cryptanalysts, including brilliant minds like Meredith Gardner and Cecil Phillips, they seized on this tiny crack in the armor.
And the process of exploiting this error was painstakingly slow and laborious. They took intercepted Soviet messages, loaded the numerical data onto IBM punch cards, and used massive, room-sized sorting machines to look for repeats in the cipher system.
By aligning messages that had been encrypted with the same page of the reused pad, which is a condition cryptanalysts call being in-depth, they could begin to strip away the additive encryption layer
And expose the underlying codebook numbers.
It is a monumental feat of logic. Over the course of the project, they successfully decoded approximately 3,000 messages.
And the impact was revolutionary. I mean, these decrypted cables definitively identified 349 Americans who were acting as Soviet agents or assets.
Venona is what exposed the code names we talked about earlier. It revealed Liberal was Klaus Fuchs. It confirmed Antenna was Julius Rosenberg.
And it identified Ailes as Alger Hiss, a really high-ranking State Department official. It essentially proved that the deep-seated fears regarding communist infiltration within the United States government were not entirely unfounded.
Right, there was a very real, very active network operating.
However, the extreme secrecy surrounding Venona created a massive operational and judicial hurdle for the FBI and the Justice Department.
Because the project remained highly classified until 1995.
The government felt that letting the Soviets know their unbreakable communications were being read was just too great a strategic risk.
Which meant that the intelligence gathered from Venona intercepts could not be introduced as evidence in a court of law during the espionage trials of the 1950s.
So wait, you have absolute mathematical proof from a decrypted cable that an American citizen is running a spy ring.
Yes.
But you cannot use that cable in front of a judge without burning your technological advantage. So how do intelligence agencies actually act on that kind of unusable truth? Do you just let the spy keep operating while you watch them?
That is the quintessential counterintelligence paradox of the Cold War. You possess the definitive truth, but it is unusable for prosecution. Intelligence agencies had to rely on a technique known as parallel construction.
Okay, what is that?
They would use the Venona intercepts secretly to identify the suspect. Then they would deploy aggressive conventional surveillance against that suspect, hoping they would make a tradecraft mistake that could be documented independently.
Like being photographed, meeting a known Soviet intelligence officer.
Exactly. Or they would use the knowledge gained from the intercepts to guide interrogations. They'd ask highly specific questions designed to elicit a confession without ever revealing how they knew the answers in the first place.
It is a high-stakes balancing act between neutralizing an immediate internal threat and preserving a strategic intelligence advantage that could provide, early warning of a military attack.
And Venona was just one facet of a broader systemic shift towards signals intelligence, or SIGINT.
Right. As the Cold War progressed, SIGINT really became the primary method of intelligence gathering. It is the passive 24/7 collection of intelligence via electronic intercepts. So radio waves, microwave transmissions, telemetry data.
Unlike a human spy, an intercept antenna does not sleep. It does not suffer crises of conscience, and it certainly does not demand payment.
A prime example of this technological counteroffensive in Europe was Operation Gold. This is also known as the Berlin Tunnel.
Oh, the Berlin Tunnel, initiated in 1954 as a joint operation between the CIA and MI6.
The goal was audacious, to say the least. They wanted to physically tap into the secure Soviet military landlines buried deep beneath the Soviet sector of East Berlin.
The engineering required for Operation Gold was immense. I mean, they excavated a tunnel 1,476 feet long, starting from a disguised warehouse in the American sector of West Berlin.
Digging directly beneath the heavily guarded border zone.
Right, and tapping into 3 subterranean communication cables.
The logistics are just staggering to think about. They had to manage all the displaced soil without alerting the East German border guards above them. And they had to prevent moisture from shorting out the cables when they attached the taps.
But they succeeded, and the yield was massive. They funneled the audio back to a processing center in London, resulting in 443,000 transcribed conversations.
Detailing Warsaw Pact troop movements, logistical capabilities, and daily military orders.
But the terrible, defining irony of Operation Gold is that the KGB knew about it before the first shovel even hit the dirt.
Because of George Blake, right?
Yes, George Blake, a Soviet mole working within MI6, had attended the initial planning meetings in London and alerted his handlers in Moscow.
So the Soviets knew the tunnel was there the entire time.
The entire time.
They let the CIA and MI6 spend massive amounts of money to dig it. And they intentionally fed routine, non-critical traffic through those specific cables to protect George Blake's cover.
They kept up the charade until they conveniently discovered the tap in 1956 during a supposedly routine maintenance check.
It perfectly illustrates the intense asymmetries and the layered deceptions in SIGINT during the Cold War. The United States and its allies maintained a distinct technological edge in intersection capabilities and decryption processing power.
And to counter this Western advantage, the Soviets heavily invested in countermeasures. They buried secure landlines, utilized complex encryption algorithms, and eventually adopted technologies like frequency-hopping radios.
Let us explain frequency hopping, because it becomes a major part of military communications.
Yeah, please do.
Instead of transmitting on one static radio frequency that an enemy can easily tune into and record, the transmitter and receiver rapidly switch their operating frequency hundreds of times a second.
So they hop across the spectrum based on a pseudo-random sequence known only to them.
Right. If you were trying to intercept it without the sequence, you just hear brief, incomprehensible bursts of static across different channels. It was specifically designed to deny the West access to tactical SIGINT.
And because the Soviets felt they were lagging in the overall technological race, they relied heavily on their own SIGINT networks, not just for espionage, but for strategic warning.
They were constantly scanning the airwaves for any anomaly, any shift in Western communication patterns that might indicate an impending preemptive attack.
And as the Cold War dragged on from the 1940s into the 1960s and 70s, the nature of the immediate human threat began to shift as well.
The early ideological fervor, the scientists and aristocrats who spied because they deeply believed in a philosophical model of the world, that generation was fading out or had been caught.
They were replaced by a new breed of spies, driven by entirely different motivations.
We enter what historians often categorize as the mercenary era. The primary motivations shifted dramatically from philosophical or political alignment to financial gain, debt relief, and personal grievance against employers or the government.
Let us look at the devastating case of the Walker spy ring. In 1967, John A. Walker Jr., a chief warrant officer in the United States Navy, simply walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and volunteered to sell cryptographic materials.
He wasn't recruited in some sophisticated intelligence operation. He literally walked through the front door because he needed money to fund a lavish lifestyle and pay off debts.
And because of his position in the Navy, Walker had access to the daily key lists for the rotor-based cipher machines used by the U.S. military.
Which is huge. Over the next decade, Walker expanded his operation into a family business. He recruited his brother, his friend Jerry Whitworth, who is also a Navy radioman, and even his own son into the ring.
The volume of material they compromised over an 18-year period is difficult to overstate. They passed an estimated 1.5 to 2 million pages of highly classified cryptographic documents to the KGB.
By possessing the daily key lists, the Soviets could just set their own cipher machines to mirror the American ones.
This allowed the Soviets to decrypt up to 30% of all U.S. naval messages in real time.
That is significant. They knew the operational locations and patrol tactics of American nuclear submarines. They could read the communications between carrier strike groups.
It was a catastrophic, systemic breach of national security, and it was entirely motivated by cash.
We see a similar, though perhaps more chaotic and amateurish, dynamic in the case of Christopher Boyce and Andrew Dalton Lee from 1975 to 1977.
Right, the Boyce and Lee case highlights a different vulnerability. Christopher Boyce worked at TRW, a major private defense contractor in California.
He was a clerk in a secure vault, granting him access to highly classified details regarding cutting-edge U.S. satellite reconnaissance programs, specifically the Rhyolite program.
The Rhyolite satellites were a massive leap in SIGINT capabilities. They were placed in geosynchronous orbit, meaning they hovered over a fixed point on the Earth.
And they were designed to act like massive vacuums in space, sucking up the microwave telemetry data transmitted by Soviet ballistic missiles during their test flights.
Knowing the exact capabilities of Rhyolite allowed the Soviets to encrypt or disguise their telemetry.
And Boyce was motivated by a complex mixture of anti-Vietnam War sentiment, a general disillusionment with the ethics of the U.S. government, and financial incentive.
So he routinely smuggled the satellite blueprints and cipher keys out of his secure office. His childhood friend, Andrew Dalton Lee, who was a drug dealer looking for a new revenue stream, acted as the courier.
Lee traveled to Mexico City and physically delivered the documents to Soviet handlers at the embassy.
But Lee's tradecraft was incredibly sloppy. He drew attention to himself, which eventually led to Mexican police arresting him, finding the microfilm, and unraveling the entire operation.
But the Boyce-Lee case really highlighted a massive structural vulnerability: the increasing reliance of the intelligence community on private sector contractors to handle highly sensitive national security data.
The perimeter of security had expanded beyond heavily vetted government agencies, creating thousands of new points of entry for espionage.
And the KGB recognized this vulnerability within the Western defense industry and systematically exploited it. They established Directorate T, later known as Line X, which was an intelligence division entirely dedicated to targeting Western scientific and technical intelligence.
They realized that stealing a blueprint was far cheaper and faster than funding years of original research.
They weren't just stealing military secrets like bomb designs anymore. They were engaging in massive industrial espionage.
They targeted blueprints for mainframe computers, semiconductor manufacturing techniques, and precision machine tools.
It is estimated that Line X operations accelerated Soviet industrial and technological capabilities by 10 to 15 years in select fields. They were effectively subsidizing their own research and development budgets through wholesale theft.
This massive, continent-wide operation was only fully exposed when a deeply disillusioned KGB officer, Vladimir Vetrov, decided to act against the Soviet system.
Under the codename Farewell, Vetrov provided French intelligence, who then shared it with the CIA with thousands of internal documents detailing the exact structure of the Line X network and the technologies they had stolen.
But the West had its own highly placed human assets behind the Iron Curtain as well.
Right. One of the most historically critical was Oleg Penkovsky, a colonel in the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence.
Penkovsky was not motivated by money, but rather a deep-seated anger toward the Soviet leadership, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, whom Penkovsky viewed as reckless and dangerous.
From 1960 to 1962, Penkovsky supplied the CIA and MI6 with over 5,000 pages of technical documents.
Penkovsky's access was unparalleled, and he delivered this intelligence via dead drops.
Those are the prearranged hidden locations in Moscow, like behind a radiator in a specific apartment building lobby, right?
Exactly, where he would quickly leave film canisters for Western handlers to retrieve later without ever making face-to-face contact. The information Penkovsky provided detailed the exact operational parameters and deployment statuses of Soviet ballistic missiles.
And that intelligence proved to be absolutely vital during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. When U-2 spy planes photographed the missile sites under construction in Cuba, analysts used Penkovsky's documents to definitively identify the specific types of missiles being installed.
And crucially, to accurately assess how long it would take for them to become fully operational and ready to fire.
He essentially gave President John F. Kennedy the exact playbook of Soviet capabilities. This allowed the U.S. administration to call Khrushchev's bluff regarding Soviet nuclear superiority, which helped avert a global nuclear war.
Penkovsky was eventually caught through KGB counter-surveillance and executed, but his historical impact was monumental.
But when you compare the profound strategic impact of a motivated insider like Penkovsky to someone like John Walker, I want to probe the psychology of the insider threat for a second.
Okay.
If you are a counterintelligence officer who keeps you up at night, is a mercenary spy Someone doing it just for the money, inherently more dangerous than an ideological spy because they lack any limiting moral framework?
Mm.
Or are they actually easier to catch because their greed eventually overrides their caution?
This raises an important question about the predictability of human behavior in high-stakes environments. An ideological spy like those in the Cambridge Five operates with a perverse kind of discipline.
Because they believe in a calling.
Right. They believe they are fighting a righteous generational war, which makes them careful, patient, and willing to lie dormant for years if necessary. A mercenary spy, driven by a financial debt or personal grievance, is inherently volatile.
Because their need for continuous financial gratification often drives them to take unnecessary, escalating risks.
Exactly. They might steal more volume than they safely can, or recruit reckless accomplices like Andrew Dalton Lee. They are potentially more destructive in the sheer indiscriminate volume of material they might compromise to get a bigger payout.
But their lack of professional discipline often orchestrates their own eventual downfall.
That is usually how it goes.
And as these human breaches and technological interceptions continue decade after decade, the psychological toll of this invisible war really began to mount.
The pervasive fear generated by decades of unseen espionage culminated in states turning their massive surveillance apparatuses inward, focusing the tools of war on their own citizens.
We reach the absolute apex of paranoia. And nowhere in the Cold War world was this more apparent or more systematically executed than in East Germany with the Ministry for State Security, universally known as the Stasi.
Established in 1950, the Stasi's stated goal was total information awareness. They wanted to know everything about everyone.
The sheer scale of the Stasi apparatus is difficult to comprehend. By the end of the Cold War, they had roughly 90,000 full-time employees. But what made the Stasi truly terrifying was their network of unofficial collaborators.
These were everyday citizens, teachers, factory workers, doctors, just spying on their neighbors, their colleagues, and in some tragic cases, their own spouses.
They had 170,000 of these active informants. That means roughly 1 out of every 63 citizens in East Germany was actively working for the secret police.
This massive human intelligence network was backed by an industrial-scale bureaucracy devoted entirely to surveillance. The Stasi maintained incredibly detailed physical files on approximately 5.6 million people.
They utilized sophisticated audio and video surveillance hidden in the private homes of suspected dissidents. They systematically monitored all forms of communication.
Let us look at the mechanics of that monitoring. Department M of the Stasi was a division entirely dedicated to reading the mail.
They developed specialized tools, right? Using high-powered hot air blowers to melt the adhesive on envelopes so they could open them without leaving a trace or tearing the paper.
They would extract the letters, inspect the contents for subversive material, photograph them if necessary, and then use assembly line machinery to reseal them perfectly before sending them back into the postal system.
It is literally the industrialization of paranoia. And to understand the effectiveness of the Stasi, we have to look at the psychological concept of the panopticon.
Ah, the panopticon. A theoretical prison design where the inmates can be observed by a single guard, but the inmates cannot see the guard.
Because they never know exactly when they are being watched, they have to assume they are always being watched, and therefore they police their own behavior. The Stasi successfully turned the entire nation of East Germany into a panopticon.
And the East Germans weren't just focusing inward. Their foreign intelligence wing, the HVA, led for decades by the legendary spy master Marcus Wolf, deeply infiltrated West Germany's public institutions, defense industries, and government offices,
placing secretaries and aides right next to West German chancellors.
Furthermore, the intelligence agencies of the Eastern Bloc did not operate in isolated silos. They collaborated extensively to track threats.
In 1977, the Stasi and other Warsaw Pact intelligence services established the SOUD database. This was a centralized, computerized repository containing detailed information on over 188,000 people deemed to be dangerous to the communist regimes.
It's a digital blacklist spanning an entire continent, a precursor to modern shared intelligence databases.
But this intense reliance on ubiquitous surveillance and automated signals intelligence nearly sparked the exact catastrophic war it was meant to prevent.
Yes. In November 1983, NATO conducted a routine, planned military exercise called Able Archer 83.
It was a command post exercise designed to simulate a period of conflict escalation leading up to a coordinated nuclear release by Western forces.
Here is where the over-reliance on electronic technology, devoid of human context, becomes incredibly dangerous. The Soviets, fully aware that they were technologically lagging behind the West in conventional weaponry, depended heavily on their SIGINT networks to provide early, strategic warning of an impending NATO attack.
During the Able Archer exercise, Soviet listening stations in East Germany and Czechoslovakia detected a sudden, complete cessation of normal radio traffic from the U.S. Army's 56th Artillery Brigade.
Which is the unit that controlled the nuclear-armed Pershing missiles in West Germany.
This radio silence was immediately followed by a comprehensive theater-wide change in cryptographic ciphers and radio frequencies across the entire U.S. 7th Army.
To the NATO commanders running the simulation, this was just the script of the war game. They were practicing radio silence procedures.
But to the Soviet analysts sitting in listening posts, staring at their intercept equipment and lacking the highly placed human intelligence assets on the ground, to confirm that it was merely an exercise.
These electronic signatures looked exactly like the genuine textbook preparatory steps for a preemptive nuclear strike.
The Soviet leadership, primed by their own intelligence assessments to expect a Western attack, misinterpreted the electronic data of the exercise as the real thing.
They placed their own nuclear forces, including combat aircraft in East Germany and Poland, on high alert, ready to launch a massive retaliatory strike.
The world came uncomfortably close to a full-scale nuclear exchange, simply because the intelligence apparatus was trapped in a feedback loop of its own paranoia.
Relying entirely on electronic blips without the human context required to interpret them correctly.
That is terrifying, and it makes you question the very efficiency of a mass surveillance state. If you collect files on millions of your own citizens and you intercept every radio signal bouncing across the atmosphere, don't you eventually just drown your own analysts in useless noise?
You absolutely do.
You collect so much data that you lose the cognitive ability to distinguish what is actually an imminent threat and what is just a training exercise or a civilian conversation.
Exactly. It is the paradox of total information awareness. When a system attempts to surveil everything, it effectively prioritizes nothing. The Stasi created a society built on pervasive fear, where the goal wasn't just to catch active dissidents, but to enforce psychological conformity.
But in terms of actual strategic national security, drowning in massive datasets often leads to severe confirmation bias.
Analysts become overwhelmed and only see the patterns or threats they're already politically primed to expect, which is precisely the analytical failure that brought the world to the brink during Able Archer.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back and look at the mechanics of this entire era, we see that Cold War espionage was the shadow conflict that truly defined the second half of the 20th century. From the highly technical atomic secrets stolen by ideologically driven scientists at Los Alamos,
To the aristocratic betrayals of the Cambridge Five navigating the blind spots of the British class system.
and we see the evolution into the mathematical triumphs of Project Venona, breaking the one-time pads.
Shifting into the mercenary betrayals of the 1970s, driven by financial greed.
And finally culminating in the paranoid extremes of the Stasi's societal panopticon and the near miss of Able Archer. Espionage, in a very real sense, was the mechanism that kept the Cold War cold.
By ensuring mutual deterrence, making sure both sides knew just enough about the other's capabilities to be utterly terrified of pressing the button, it prevented a conventional hot war.
But it exacted a heavy psychological toll, creating a culture of suspicion that permanently altered global politics. And this isn't just distant history locked in a filing cabinet.
No, the digital privacy debates and the cybersecurity threats we read about in the news today.
Right. State-sponsored hacking of infrastructure, the theft of intellectual property, the mass collection of communications data.
These are the direct evolutionary descendants of the analog operations we've discussed today. The technology has evolved from hot air blowers and punch cards to malware and algorithms, but the underlying mechanics of the shadow war remain exactly the same.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat unsettling concept to consider. Throughout the Cold War, the greatest threat to a nation was the human mole, the individual who carefully smuggled a physical document out of a secure facility.
But in today's hyper-connected, open-source world, where every single person leaves a massive continuous digital footprint with every click, swipe, location, ping, and purchase, is the classic concept of the human mole becoming obsolete.
Or, Perhaps even more terrifyingly, are we simply letting in a reality where the immense surveillance tools of the Stasi haven't disappeared, but have instead been digitized, privatized, monetized, and willingly carried in our own pockets every single day? We started by saying the traditional battlefield vanished into the fog of the Cold War, but maybe the battlefield didn't vanish at all. Maybe the chessboard just expanded to encompass every aspect of daily life, and now we're all standing on it.
That is quite a thought to end on.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.